Good afternoon. Welcome to Hooting Yard on the Air. My name is Frank Key. This week I'm going to read you a record review, a review of a CD, a fairly lengthy review which appeared in the Weekly Shackle, that wonderful family newspaper. And it's a review of the Phlogiston Variations by Winslow, an 8 CD set, mid-price. Unwrapping the cellophane from this handsome boxed set took me the best part of an hour. Such was my excitement that the word Butterfingers might have been invented for me, and it was only by dint of a pair of extremely sharp scissors that I eventually succeeded. That was not the end of my troubles, for I had the devil of a job to discard the shredded wrapper into my wastepaper basket. Gleaming strands of cellophane stuck resolutely to my fingers, however desperately I flapped my arms around, like a conjurer casting a peculiarly inept spell. Is this relevant? Well, yes, I think it is. The tactile struggle to extricate the box from its packaging was nothing compared to the auditory struggle I then underwent, listening at one sitting to the 9 hours and 47 minutes of the quite majestic Phlogiston Variations. Younger listeners may be unfamiliar with the work of the Alaskan-Flemish composer Chlorine Angina Winslow, 1882 to 1941. Her operetta The Paving Slabs was recently revived by a troupe of Finnish amateurs, and the jazz spinettist Dennis Jowett included a version of The Retention of Milk on his 1991 solo album. But otherwise, this towering figure of 20th century music has fallen victim to almost criminal neglect. So, this reissue of the Phlogiston Variations, recorded by the Hooting Yard Ensemble in 1959, is more than welcome, and will, I hope, go some way towards the rehabilitation of Winslow. I've never understood why she's been all but forgotten. At the peak of her success in the 1920s, her works were regularly performed in concert halls throughout the world, and critical plaudits were bestowed on her even by such cantankerous misanthropes as Wrigley, who described her memorably as the greatest Alaskan composer of the last and probably the next 500 years. Winslow had in fact left Alaska at the age of 4. Her mother, a weasel breeder of Flemish extraction, fled the country after her husband, Winslow's father, was shot dead in one of the sporadic outbreaks of gang warfare which blighted Afognak Island in the Gulf of Alaska during the 1880s. Mother and daughter moved first to Sumatra, then traipsed through various seaside resorts in the north of England, before settling in Danzig in 1896. Winslow had shown a precocious talent as a bassoonist, and her mother enrolled her in some sort of cut-price music school in the city, run by Professor Ignaz Milkbone, a wizened old git of questionable morals, whose police record filled at least 2 whole filing cabinets in the basement storeroom of the Danzig Western District Criminal Justice Headquarters. He was a foul, foul man, and a teacher of genius. Winslow studied under him for 11 years in all. In that time, she developed from a promising teenage bassoonist into an all-round musical talent of frightening proficiency. Her first composition proper, the Suite for String Quartet, Large Drum, Train Whistle, Castanets and Medicine Balls, was written when she was 17. At the very end of the 19th century, she was anticipating the innovations that Schrack-Rent, Willis and Toadbrow would take credit for 20 or 30 years later. One winter's morning in 1907, Professor Milkbone was arrested in the middle of Winslow's glockenspiel lesson. He was charged with multifarious crimes, to all of which he confessed, and imprisoned for a very, very long time. This was a decisive event for the young composer. Her teacher's pedagogy was so rich, so omnifriculative, that to have broken from him voluntarily was near impossible. In time, no doubt, it would have stifled the wild and inventive creative impulse to which Winslow now gave free rein. Forced by circumstances to go her own way, she embarked on a series of works which, to those of us privileged to have heard them, continue to astonish the ears decades after they were written. This is not the place to attempt a biographical sketch of Chlorine Winslow. In any case, her life was one of unremitting tedium, as attested by Sidney Ullage, who complained of the absence of even the teensy-weensiest speck of interest in her life after Milkbone had been packed off to jail. Nonetheless, between 1907 and her death in 1941, Winslow created a corpus of work arguably unrivalled by any of her contemporaries. The ideas spilled out of her with dizzying fecundity. The phlogiston variations, completed in 1929, is, we ought to remind ourselves, her opus 954. She began work on the variations in 1924, planning at first a set of linked cantatas to be sung by a boys' choir to the accompaniment of a brass band, 8 separate orchestras, a pickup jazz combo, and an amateur ensemble from the Danzig Metallurgical Institute, performing upon a motley collection of laboratory equipment. The first section to be completed, the Passacaglia and Ritual Execution for viola and massed Bunsen burners, was abandoned, to be revived in the final score, transformed into duet for exhaust pipe and whimpering. She wrote most of the sulphurous impenetrabilia and spleen in the gutter movements before a commission from the Javan government to compose a new national anthem forced her to put the variations aside for a couple of years. Then, throughout 1927, she was embroiled in the disentanglement of Professor Milkbone's estate. He had died on St. Finisterre's Day, still in prison, and had made Winslow the executrix of his will. Not until December 1927 did she manage to track down the principal beneficiary, one Pansy Cradledew, the professor's 6th cousin 8 times removed, who lived in a log cabin in the midst of snow and gales, somewhere in the vastness of Greenland. The variations were completed in a frenzied bout of work during the first half of 1929, and first performed in October of that year in a buttercup-splattered field within the grounds of the Metallurgical Institute, with Winslow herself conducting and playing the trombone. Reviews were uniformly ecstatic. James Pilg, in the Macclesfield Gazette, proclaimed that, "Having experienced this music, I would happily be struck deaf tomorrow." Strangely enough, this is precisely what happened. The following day, Pilg was lunching as usual in his club when a man of gigantic stature and wild appearance bore down upon him and clapped a pair of cymbals repeatedly about his ears. Apprehended by the police, the assailant turned out to be a local tunesmith of the Tin Pan Alley sort, aggrieved at Pilg's withering review of his musical play Jasper Courtney's Electrical Wiring System in the previous week's Gazette. Pilg never regained his hearing and was forced to retire as the newspaper's music critic. For a time he wrote gardening columns and reported on local beekeeping activities. But in his despair he turned to drink and died 3 years later in the waiting room of Macclesfield railway station. He was just 32. But I digress. Winslow wrote the libretto of the variations herself. It was based upon Joseph Priestley's "The Doctrine of Phlogiston Established and that of the Composition of Water Refuted," 1800. Priestley had argued that phlogiston was a substance or principle supposed to exist in combination in all combustible bodies. In other words, it was the very matter of fire itself. The hypothesis had first been expounded by Stahl in 1702. By the time Priestley published his work a century later, it had fallen into disrepute, most scientists by then considering it to be nonsensical rubbish. Priestley stoutly maintained his belief in the existence of phlogiston, and it was this willful independence of mind which attracted Winslow. her priestly as a tragic hero, wittering on about his theories, the text of the libretto taken verbatim from his book, while a so-called pompous chorus of scientists tries to shout him down. I'm just going to have a sip of water at this stage. Such is the massive scale of the work that following the 1929 premiere, no one attempted a complete performance again until the Hooting Yard Ensemble's recording 30 years later. Winslow included excerpts from the variations in a number of her concerts during the 1930s, but it was considered too formidable a score for anyone else to have a crack at it. In his autobiography, the conductor Tadaki Billig gave a revealing account of the general reluctance to perform the work. He wrote, "I remember hanging around in a Marseille tavern with a bunch of internationally successful conductors. As we sank jar after jar of tough Matelot's ale, our talk ranged over the entire history of Western music. We tried to outdo each other, arguing that our own interpretations of various works were definitive, majestic, timeless performances which left nothing further to be said. For example, Horst Grudge claimed that his series of Helsinki concerts, in which he performed all 49 Binder symphonies, made any future approach to them a complete waste of time. No sooner had he said this than Von Pigflask spat into his beer and countered that his own version of Binder's 20th, recorded with the Ivory Coast State Radio Orchestra, was absolutely the last word on the piece, that Binder's granddaughter had been present in the studio and had wept great buckets of tears, and what's more, Grudge's handling of the pizzicata had been otiose, laughable, and the subject of derision among all of his, Von Pigflask's, pals. Grudge did not take this lying down. Immediately he let rip with a contemptuous diatribe upon the failings of Von Pigflask's 1949 version of Owlhead's Chocolate Swiss Roll Sonata. Pausing only to let the waiter bring more drinks and to mop up the spillages and vomit, he then launched into a tirade on the virtues of his Unstrebnodtaub concertos, provoking Bagbrain, who sat beside me, to tip the contents of his tankard over Grudge's head. And so it went on until someone or other, it might even have been me, mentioned Winslow's phlogiston variations. For the first time that night there was silence around the table. The first to speak was poor old Sopwith, but he was by now so drunk that none of us could understand a word he said. But at least he'd had the courage to say something. Taking our cues, each of us in turn admitted that, enormously talented as we were, our titanic egos shrivelled at the prospect of tackling Winslow's masterpiece. To attempt it, we felt, was to risk cataclysmic failure. That evening I confessed for the first time to my recurring nightmare, in which I stood down from the podium after conducting a performance of the variations, to be met with uproarious laughter, a hideous combination of ridicule and contempt, and the cackling din grew louder and louder until I woke, bathed in sweat and nearly suffocating myself with a pillow. That's the end of the extract from Tadaki Billig's memoir. But enter then Lothar Preen, the principal conductor of the Hooting Yard Ensemble, and a man every bit as vain and extravagantly bouffanted as the gang in Billig's memoir. Indeed, so convinced was Preen of his own genius that he held himself aloof from the society of his fellow conductors. Preen had made his reputation with his tremendous 1952 rendering of Owlhead's surgical opera Stalin Cured My Palsy. In 1957 he replaced Wintermuck as Commander-in-Chief of the Hooting Yard Ensemble, and he astonished the players at his first meeting with them. "We gathered together in a little hut hard by the banks of the river," recalled the accordionist Gervais Calque. "All of us sat there on wooden stools. A makeshift stage had been erected at one end of the room, on which had been placed a sumptuous armchair. We'd been waiting about half an hour when Preen crashed in, skipped onto the stage and flung himself into the chair. He lit up a cigarillo and glared at us. A rustle of sniggering swept across the hut as we registered the extravagance of his bouffon. He did not stir. 5 minutes elapsed until Preen extinguished the butt of his cigarillo in a milk bottle half filled with water, which he then put into his tote bag. Then, noisily clearing his throat, he spoke. "You are all musicians," he said. "And if Herr Wintermuck is to be believed, musicians of the highest calibre, matchless in your ability to tackle the most difficult works that the present-day composer can throw at you. Is that correct?" Not one of us was able to speak, for we were completely thrown by our new maestro's accent. Eventually, though, we managed a collective mumble of diffident assent. "Good," continued Preen. "Very good. That being the case," he screeched, "I have it in mind to lay down before you a challenge which my fellow conductors have to date shied away from. I intend to sap the lifeblood from your veins. You will wish you had never been an egg in Mamma's womb. Ha! You and I are going to astonish the world. We have 2 years. You may think it a long time. A child can learn to speak and walk in that time. But our task will be harder, infinitely harder, for tomorrow we embark upon the phlogiston variations." Never a man to do things by halves, Preen had obtained Winslow's original manuscript. Laboriously, he wrote out by hand multiple copies, sufficient not only for each member of the ensemble, but also for the additional players whom he knew would be necessary for the accomplishment of his ear-shattering design. This has led to some controversy over the real authorship of Preen's version. As Winslow herself never made a recording of the work, and as the manuscript was burned to a cinder in the conflagration which destroyed Preen's house in October 1969, only those present at the 1929 premiere still alive and in possession of gramophone players, 30 years later, are able to compare the two versions. To date, researchers have identified only 4 people who fit the bill. 1, a budgerigar enthusiast from Samarkand, now resident in a mental institution. 2, a Genovese antiquary struck deaf and dumb by a traumatic hiking accident. 3, a shambling alcoholic from Brabant whose memory is unimpaired but who speaks only in gibberish. And 4, a bus conductor from, ironically, Macclesfield, who was only 6 months old when his exiled White Russian parents dandled him on their knees at that historic 1929 concert. Another area of contention surrounding the Preen variations concerns the instrumentation. Winslow's full orchestras were pared down of necessity to the limitations of the 14-piece ensemble. Brass band and boys' choir were replaced by a hurdy-gurdy and a specially trained cat with some electronic implants. Most controversially, Preen dispensed altogether with the jumble of laboratory equipment, introducing in its place a sonically dissimilar barnyard's worth of farm implements, to be played by an octet of hyperactive 3-year-olds hired from a nearby paediatric institute. Insurance premiums demanded by the children's parents were preposterously high, and the ensemble's management board refused to pay them. Preen had no money of his own. His salary was paid direct to an organised crime syndicate in Borneo which was blackmailing him. But such was his obsession with the phlogiston variations that he struck a macabre bargain with the parents. If, he said, any of the infants were to meet with even the tiniest accident while rehearsing or performing upon the farm implements, he would slay his entire family, subject the members of the ensemble to unimaginable tortures, tear out his own beard hair by hair with a large pair of pliers, and drown himself in a barrel of fish oil. He signed a statement to this effect and had it witnessed by a priest, a judge, and a high-ranking military officer, then distributed copies to each of the parents. Ah, but he was a canny one. He also gave the names and addresses of the parents to the crime syndicate in Borneo, alleging that they were police spies ready at any moment to swoop, armed with incontrovertible evidence of the syndicate's malfeasance. For the time being, he said he could hold them off, but at the first word from him, they must dispatch murderous cutlass-wielding thugs from their HQ and strike down the parents, otherwise their worldwide criminal empire would be snuffed out in an instant. As soon as the gang acknowledged receipt of his communique, Preen collected the tots in his van, settled them into the hastily constructed nursery-cum-rehearsal room, and unleashed them upon the farm implements. His sister Hetty was installed as their tutor, and she soon had them creating the most exquisite noises as they frolicked among the churns, bindles, bean stubble rakes, subsoil pulverizer ploughs, clodding mills, potato grading shovels, and gorse pincers. Another member of the Preen family, the blackguardly Uncle Rip, was employed to convert an abandoned aircraft hangar into a recording studio. His appointment was dubious. He had neither the qualifications nor the skills to undertake such a task. Preen harangued the management board into paying his uncle a ludicrous sum, all of which was promptly salted away into one of Rip's notorious illicit ventures. Boldly, Preen demanded even further funding. He visited each member of the board in turn at the dead of night, accompanied by a brutish myrmidon supplied by his uncle. Not surprisingly, more money was made available. This time it was used to finance Uncle Rip's starch factory in North Africa. But then a third attempt to prize cash from the board was unsuccessful. Using the same tactics as before, Preen and his henchmen turned up at the house of the board's president at 3 o'clock on a bitterly cold February morning. They pounded on the door, but then were startled to be set upon by a blood-crazed, starving panther unleashed from its cleverly disguised lair on the roof. Preen suffered lacerations to the head and chest, and his bouffant was terribly disarranged. But he was luckier than his accomplice, who had an arm torn off and bore the imprint of razor-sharp fangs in his forehead for the remainder of his wretched life. The president of the management board of the Hooting Yard Ensemble stood smirking in his doorway, wrapped in a tremendously stylish dressing gown, and told Lothar Preen that Uncle Rip had been arrested late in the previous evening and was, even as they spoke, being roughed up by the doughty Inspector Kargpan and his boys down at the police station. Oh, and if Preen wanted to build his gigantic recording studio, he'd have to do the job himself. He wouldn't receive another penny from the board. Chastened, the great conductor vowed that his plans would be realised. For the next 2 years he worked like a maniac, rehearsing the ensemble by day and single-handedly building the studio at night, fiddling about with complicated electronic bitty-bobs in the cavernous interior of the hangar, sweating in the heat generated by a dozen industrial lanterns he had stolen from the site of important roadworks on the Blister Lane bypass. Eventually, on the 6th of March 1959, everything was ready. On that day, the Hooting Yard Ensemble, with auxiliary hurdy-gurdyist, cat and infants, directed by Lothar Preen, played the phlogiston variations, recording their performance in a single take of 9 hours and 47 minutes. There were no overdubs. What we can hear on these CDs is the music exactly as it was played. The grinding noises in the first movement, the percussive barrage of the second, the wistful harp and flageolet melody, drowned out by the battering of farm implements which begins that well-loved Scrofulous Battalions section. It's all here, curiously timeless, sound-pimpled, fractious, discrubiate, fanfandrious, pulchituative, ensmorbii, reflictiotrobriate, candasflurantigigious, pooned, flad, and snut. You know, poor James Pilg was right. After listening to this, you might as well go deaf. There's no other music I know of which builds a sound world so breathtaking that absolutely everything else you ever hear will seem pale, charmless and flaccid. Even my own sextet for strings, dishwater and tannoy, a 14-hour epic on which I have worked for 20 years, and which I brought to a resounding conclusion this morning. The very morning on which the postie limped towards my front door bearing the Phlogiston Variations CD box. Well, that was a few hours ago now. I've written this review in a sort of frenzy, sitting at my escritoire, my pencil tearing across the paper at inhuman speed. The floor is littered with peanut shells, for as always I've been chomping my way through hundreds of peanuts as an aid to concentration. In a few moments I'll shove these pages into an envelope addressed to the editor of the Weekly Shackle, and I'll bid Minnie to trot off to catch the last post. I will sweep up the peanut shells. I will take a bath and primp my bouffant. It is not quite of Preen-like extravagance, but I'm nurturing it carefully. I will pour myself a generous shot of 45% proof bestial freak and recline upon my purple sofa. When my tumbler is drained and I've rinsed it out, then and only then will I venture into the garden, armed with a petrol can and a box of matches. I will place the manuscript of my sextet, on which the ink is not yet dry, into my sturdy incinerator, douse it in petrol, and drop in a lighted match. As the flames crackle, I will no doubt begin to sob, the tears running freely down my cheeks, glowing in the heat of the blaze. I will be destroying the work which has occupied me and obsessed me for 2 decades, but now, having heard Winslow's Phlogiston Variations, I know in the very deepest recesses of my soul that they have been wasted years. And that's the end of the review and almost the end of today's show. I've got a little announcement to read, which I haven't read, and I'm not sure I can read the writing, although it's very clearly done, so I'll read this out. 5th of May, that's today. Frequenzen at the Douglas Coupland Short Story Award. 7 shortlisted contemporary writers present their work, and the winner will be announced by Douglas Coupland tonight at the Poetry Cafe, Betterton Street, London WC2, which is around the corner of Endell Street, Covent Garden or Holborn Tube, and it starts at 7 p.m. And Frequenzen is presented by Alexander Wendt on Monday nights on Resonance 104.4 FM, which you've been listening to. That was Hooting Yard on the Air. I'll be back next week with more stuff. Bye.